everyone, and welcome to Backseat Sports. I'm Josh, that is Caleb, and today, football season is, I would say, officially upon us as the start of fall camp is officially here. And so Nebraska's kicking it off. Matt Rhule era is underway, and really in a lot of ways, we're going to be talking about this today. Matt Rhule seems to be really trying to bring this Scott Frost era to an end. And today we'll be talking about Matt Rhule's real plan for Nebraska this season and into the future. And we'll be talking about kind of like the expectations that Matt Rhule has for this season. And of course, the big news and all of these things that are related with players being kicked off the team, players being sent home, a coach gone, and a lot more. So there's a lot to talk about. We've been going through it all today. Caleb, how you doing?
Man, Josh, I'm doing great. I'm excited for all these camp hype videos to be pumped out by the university. I just can't wait for the clips. Just to see some live practice. It's very exciting. All the pot. Again, it really does feel like football season is back and really underway. I mean, as we keep rolling, and man, just Matt Rhule. It feels like he's doing what he's been talking about. You know, he's been preaching. He's now implementing in the team again with these harsh deadlines and high expectations for his players. And again, it was not all smoke and mirrors. It feels like that is really what he's just trying to do at Nebraska, trying to set that culture early. And some big news on different players.
Kind of just to kick us off here, like realistically, we had heard Matt Rhule talk about kind of these expectations that he had and talked about the culture that he wanted to establish. And, you know, when new coaches get hired, I think you kind of always just sort of assume that, like, all right, this is just going to be the coach speak. Like, oh, yeah, establish your culture. The last guy didn't have the right one, yada, yada, yada. But this time around, I think Rhule is maybe more than what we saw with even Frost, really establishing this. And we're seeing that now, and some of the fruits of his labor starting to play out here into camp. I think not just the news and, with Myles Farmer, which we're going to talk about here in a second, that this actually has like long-term real implications on the future because this reflects on what Matt Rhule's expectations actually are. So with that said, this was the big news, is that Myles Farmer has been suspended according to Matt Rhule, and he did not make the 120, which means that his scholarship has apparently been revoked. And so essentially Rhule said it's up to him whether he wants to keep playing and how that's going to look essentially. So there's a lot going on here. First of all, what are your first impressions? We can talk about the football side of things first, and then talk about the philosophical debate about what this means for Rhule and his establishment. And then we'll talk more about, the coaching and everything else. So what are your thoughts here on Myles Farmer?
It's crazy, man. We lose a guy that's probably up there on snap counts on our team. He has to be for sure in the top 15.
Yeah, one of the veterans.
Yeah, he is one of the veteran guys. So for him to be kind of kicked off the team, and again, the quote is like, small stuff. It seems like a very big deal because, again, I don't think it's super easily replaceable. I think, again, that, our secondary was kind of a strength. And again, Myles Farmer with another year, I was, expecting even another step up from the season. So it is really surprising, and it is a big hurt for our defensive side of the ball, I think. So for him, to be essentially, he's going to have to choose whether or not he wants to re-enter the team. It's wild.
Seems unlikely.
I wouldn't hold my breath.
I wouldn't be putting my chips on that one.
Yeah, I would not either.
Like you said, he has 1,376 snaps at Nebraska, which when it comes to the secondary, or really the players who are currently on this roster, that is up there. It's like Quentin Newsome, Reimer, Henrich, a few of the offensive linemen, Turner and Benhart, those guys come in as staples here, but it's a pretty short list of guys who have had that many snaps on this team. Just from the football side, what are your thoughts on replacements? Who could see this? The big issue right now is that Marques Buford's injury and his recovery isn't going as fast as what we originally thought in the summer or early on in the spring. And so Rhule said that right now he's going to miss at least the early parts of fall camp. And he's still a question mark as whether or not he'll be ready for the Minnesota game. So if he's not ready, the guy who was going to be there was Myles Farmer. And now it's a real question mark about our depth here in the secondary, especially at safety. So our eyes will be dead set on the Minnesota game and who actually walks out there. Because at this point, it's going to probably be a big question mark if Buford doesn't end up being healthy. And what are your thoughts? Do you think Buford's going to be there?
Rhule seems to be taking people with precaution, but again, we're going to need him so bad. But again, you don't want to sacrifice the whole season for one game, and I don't think he'd do that. So
Rhule's quote was, "We're going to be really smart with him, take some time. We hope he'll be back, but we're going to be really methodical in the way he goes." By "we hope he'll be back," he means before the Minnesota game.
Yeah, my thought is probably no again, because you want when you don't have a lot of depth, you're going to want him for the whole season. You're not going to sacrifice that for the first game out. So my guess, and then if you don't play him for the Minnesota game, then it's like some of those other weaker non-con teams. It's like you can really take your time. So I think that's probably likely that
I agree. I mean, if it wasn't Minnesota, I would say almost for sure he wouldn't be there. But because it is Minnesota, he's going to want to be there. And you know that we're going to need him in a game like that, especially when Buford hits so hard. He's such an enforcer on the field. And
that's where, again, come at some of those transfer portal guys like Collier, I guess, like, again, with no prior snaps, is probably going to see playing time.
That's Corey Collier from Florida, and like you said, he had no snaps at Florida. He just played a few special team snaps and didn't record any stats in the book. So that's a question mark, obviously, in itself. Still a younger guy who hasn't had the playing time, and then there's a bunch of other names too.
Yeah, again, like I don't. Like Hill, it doesn't.
Right? Are you moving Tommy Hill back there? Is it like Deshaun Singleton? Is it Phelan Sanford, the red-white game MVP?
Honestly, the dark horse, in the race. I think Phelan Sanford, honestly, just because the dude's a special team wizard. Yeah, I mean, that's how far back in the depth chart we are now, which is crazy. Like, even before the season starts, that's before we have normal football injuries that just happen week to week as this goes on. So now our secondary, which looked to be again kind of in a stronger spot, is now worrisome without Myles Farmer.
There's just no experience back there at all. So it's like, behind Isaac Gifford, probably at Rover would be like Javin Wright. So maybe he could move back there to safety. Or then we look at the other cornerbacks like Javier Morton, and like we said, Tommy Hill already. So I don't know. We know how great Tommy Hill was last year.
Yeah, not great. He got moved to wide receiver. That's how great he was.
He got moved to wide receiver is how good he was. And he's probably our second string corner right now.
Yeah.
So that's good. So, I mean, right now, when it comes to depth, that's where you have to get really worried. And, from a pure football perspective, this is pretty bad news.
Yeah, and again, for secondary, I just really think it is you just need reps to be solid. You're going to make big mistakes early. And so I think as a vet, it's just such a leg up because it is such just a hard position. I don't think right now, just with the way that the rules are set up, being a secondary player is probably one of the toughest spots in the sport on the defensive side of the ball. So that just it's going to equal big plays, I believe.
We'll see. That the secondary went from really exciting to now, I mean, a little bit less exciting with more question marks. We're relying on Omar Brown now to be incredibly good. So yeah, that's going to be the talking point of the next few weeks, probably on the defensive side is where we're at with Buford in the secondary. So from the other news aspects, I do want to talk more about this from the philosophical standpoint of Matt Rhule's perspective on things. And we can also talk about some of the moves that have happened here. The debate comes from whether or not this is actually a net positive move for Nebraska. From a football perspective, it's really difficult to argue, but from a team building perspective and a culture perspective, this very well could be the right move. I mean, we talked about that just these last few weeks about the 10 list that Nebraska put out, which was the guys who are the character guys, the hard workers, the guys that represent Nebraska football. And there was 30 guys on the list. So if you weren't on the list, it was pretty surprising. And basically none of the secondary was on the list.
Which was really surprising.
Considering that so many of the defense and so many of the guys like Quentin Newsome and Myles Farmer have been here for a while. So
and done good things on the field.
The question is, Myles Farmer had a history, last year he had a DUI. And so, it's unknown exactly to the extent at which things went wrong. But from Matt Rhule's own mouth, he said it was like you said earlier, it was a bunch of small things, which is why it's so shocking that you would basically revoke a player's scholarship for a bunch of small things.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't feel like a move that other teams in the country would make or other coaches in the country would make. And so for me, this is Matt Rhule really doubling down. And this is a bigger statement than just a player losing a scholarship. This is Matt Rhule really doubling down on the future of Nebraska, because obviously revoking a guy like Myles Farmer, especially while Buford is hurt, is a huge hit on the first few weeks of the season for Nebraska, and inherently the depth of the secondary, like we talked about. So like from a football perspective, it's a huge net negative. And so you are hurting this team up front. Matt Rhule seems to be really doubling down on the idea that he's in this for the long haul. And he really wants to emphasize this idea that that we are establishing this culture of being on time and being disciplined. And the quote was that he said, you're going to be hard pressed to basically find another team in the country like as disciplined as this team. Or we're going to be one of the most disciplined teams in the country. So what are your thoughts? Do you see this as big of a statement? How do you think this reflects on Matt Rhule's opinion of this upcoming season versus the future?
It's hard to know. I'm still wondering if, there's more to the story. Just as time unfolds with Myles Farmer specifically, but just in general,
his decision making.
Yeah, just like what all were the small things, or just in general the things. That was part of it. But if it is just the small stuff, so if that is the case and there was nothing else, and it really was just not showing up on time, missing
being
stuff,
late for some meetings, missing play calls, not studying the playbook, yada yada yada, not staying on weight or whatever.
Yeah, not going to class enough. Whatever like the small things are. If that's the case, and I really do think that is a powerful message from him. I also think that he is like also realistic on. Like, he wants to be disciplined and knows that some people will and some people won't. I really liked his quote that he said, like with the playbooks. He said that, the young guys, the ones that are going to be, influential on our team are the guys that are going to really buy in and commit to like studying the playbook. And he said that a lot of people won't, but the few people that will are going to they're going to see the field essentially. And so I think that he has really realistic expectations of like knowing just people and how that's going to work. So I do think that's a strong message from Matt Rhule. And I think that's one that I think will pay off.
Because like one of his quotes from the recent pressers was like, I don't want year 2 to be a year 1. And this is year 1. And so to me, it seems like he's in a lot of ways doesn't have very high expectations for this season, or at least isn't prioritizing success in year 1. Because like, I think this also comes down to play to the decision with Casey Thompson, and the second, or maybe even from the beginning, like it didn't seem like they wanted to have a 1-year rental, no matter how good Casey Thompson could have been. I think part of the debate or the discussion for the coaching staff may have been like, we want a guy who's going to be here for at least 2 years, 3 years, like Jeff Sims. Even if it's a slight downgrade to Casey Thompson. I mean, do you think that came into play?
I mean, I definitely think that they were building for the future somewhat. I think that Sims was probably just a guy that they really liked on their board. Like, I do think
I mean, definitely.
I think that was probably the most of it, where it's just like, this is a guy that we wanted to get. He's available. I don't know, like, if they want a dual threat guy all the time, or, that just doesn't fit the type of team that we thought they had. And so they were really playing into that. They would have wanted Casey in camp. I think that competition with him and Sims would have only made them better.
Sure. I mean, from the coach's perspective, of course you want 2 starting level quarterbacks.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I think they just wanted to bring Sims.
But they had to have known that if they bring in Jeff Sims and say he's the starter, Casey's going to leave. Duh. I mean, like we talked about this before. It's like he has to leave if he wants to have a future, have any chance of a future in the NFL. So, I mean, he had to leave.
Unless he again was undeniable and could win that job again. So, but I mean,
But if the coaches wanted to have a coach or have a quarterback who was going to be there for 2 years to really set the standard, set the culture, to build off of, all of these things, then I can see the argument from the coach's side if they think it's at least competitive.
The one thing I really liked with the whole culture, the very NFL vibey, was the Josh Fleek's overweight sent home.
That's news.
I do absolutely love this, again, for Rhule in the same way. It feels very reminiscent of like Eddie Lacy.
Shout out Eddie.
But again,
Eddie.
You got to come prepared. And I think this kind of it would lead me toward, with Myles Farmer, maybe it literally was small things that we could take Matt Rhule at his word on that. Because again, it's just like you had to take care of your body in this offseason. You did not. You showed up just not prepared at all. That doesn't mean you get to be on the team. Like there is consequences for what you did. And so I do really like that, again, on both of them. With that being the case, I think that's really exciting. And again, accountability is important, in any, the workplace or again, a football team. So again, that's just, if you actually want to have some sort of actual standard to be actually setting it so that people understand that there is a level of commitment, I think that is exciting for Nebraska football and will pay dividends.
So, okay, well then this is where we get down to the crux of the situation here. Do you actually think Matt Rhule has high expectations for this season? Or do you think he's kind of sitting at like that 5-6 win type of like he's hoping for a bowl game?
Like, I mean, I definitely
that's
think
where it feels like to me.
I mean, I feel like again, like the whole coach thing, like they're going to try and win every game. I think
of course they're going to say that.
I do think partially in my mind, maybe he doesn't think Myles Farmer moves the needle enough. I mean, more than anything, right? Because if he really is like a star player in your mind.
So that's the debate.
Yeah. So
like if he actually thought he was a star player, would he have kicked him off?
I don't know. I feel like you'd go, I don't know. You coax him along a little bit more, right?
Yeah. You find that you give him more support.
But he's like, maybe in the Matt Rhule mind, maybe it's like having a young guy get these reps now and do it the right way.
That's what I'm saying. So his long-term priorities are like, well, who cares? Like in the long term, the guy, and I also think reps.
In his mind too, it's like with the short-term success, maybe he doesn't feel that like by the end of the season, it's really that different. I mean, you get to look at some of the guys that came in as freshmen last year and had a great impact on our team, and like they were solid enough to win games by the end of the season. They were difference makers.
Osman and Hartzog.
Yeah, exactly. So, maybe he thinks he has that in the guys that he brought. I think partially, I don't think he was I think in my mind, he just wouldn't have been that concerned about Myles Farmer, which does, again, it shocks me, shocks you because he did have so much snaps. Because I think he knows that in this game, like you still have to have some sort of results to, because you want to keep the recruits, the hype, everything up for this next season. Right. So I don't think I know that he knows that he's going to be given some time, obviously, with the contract and everything else that he's been given. Myles Farmer didn't move the needle enough for him on a winning basis.
My narrative would be more than likely that he probably saw Myles Farmer as a bad influence on the rest of the secondary who wasn't acting in the way that he believes the defense or any Nebraska player should be acting when it comes to being responsible and being on time and all of these things. And because he's one of the elder players on the team, and in the senior class, he didn't feel like he was a leader that justified his like you said, the negatives outweighed the positives when it came to being replaceable enough that he was a too bad of an influence on the team to keep around versus the talent that he brought. And so I think at the end of the day, it probably comes down to that, which is still sacrificing a significant amount of talent on field ability for this season for, the growing pains, like you said, of some busted coverages in some of these games, especially in the first 6 or 7 weeks.
Probably.
And it's going to happen, especially if Buford's not healthy. So that's where I think it gets really interesting and why, I mean, as much as Matt Rhule wants to win every single game this year, which of course he does. He's a competitive guy. I think he's also realistic and probably, in my opinion, sees 7 wins as a great, incredible outcome for this year. And we haven't had a 500 season in the last 5 years. So, I mean, long story short, I just think that, but most coaches who come in maybe they believe it. They believe that they can immediately turn this thing into a 8 or 9, 10 win team. But I don't think Rhule believes that at all. So that's where I think Husker fans who are saying we could win 8 or 9 games this year, it's like, I don't see the argument for that. Especially when looking at the schedule, I think 6 wins is very realistic. 7 is possible. I mean, 8 would be if everything goes our way. 9 is insane. and probably not happening. So long story short, I just think Rhule is truly setting the standard. And we can talk about Bob Wager as well. So that, of course, this was also news. The tight end coach, Bob Wager, resigned after a DUI incident and a situation that was obviously not great, but Wager took responsibility for it and ended up resigning. Which is interesting. I mean, and again, compared to past situations in Nebraska where there were coaches who had DUIs that were reported and potentially multiple times,
and they stayed on,
and they were still on the team.
So again, like, low tolerance for that kind of.
This is a tighter ship, and again, when Rhule is compared to Frost, where like it was confirmed by the end that Frost was like late to meetings. He was missing recruiting visits, like or at least being late to recruiting visits. And, not very timely of a guy for what should be happening for a head coach. And where Matt Rhule is like, he said, guys are showing up like at 8:04-ish, but I want them to be 5 minutes early. And that's the type of culture we're building here. And we want to be a culture of, integrity and developing men, not just football players and all of these things. I really think he's living up to that. I guess we want to bring it back to the tight end coaching situation here. Josh Martin was elevated to the tight ends coach. And so do you have any opinions on the tight end room or thoughts on how that could affect the team and recruiting in the future?
I mean, again, Wager was a good recruiter, but it's crazy. We already had one waiting in the wings. I really liked what Matt Rhule also said on this in his press conference about because he hopes that guys are going to have, he knows that coaches are going to have opportunities here to kind of move up and around. So he wants those analyst positions to be really good guys waiting in the wings so that, again, they can just be able to reload and already kind of be in the system and doing that. So I really liked Matt Rhule's perspective on this. And again, he's wanting his guys to, flourish, move on, get the head coaching jobs and, build that coaching tree up. And I really like that from him. Again, I mean, it is a loss again, because he was a pretty good recruiter, I believe. So, but I think we'll be okay.
I mean, it's crazy because Josh Martin, he has years and years of experience coaching tight ends, and he was at SMU, and he even produced some NFL draft picks from SMU at the tight end position. So he's like a legit tight ends coach. So that works out pretty good. When it comes to losing a tight end coach right before the season, to have a guy who's literally been a tight ends coach just walk right in is thank goodness for that. So overall, I'm really interested. I mean, this creates a lot more question marks on the defensive side. Overall, it adds some more question marks in general to the team heading into fall camp, which is what we'll be talking about in upcoming videos, of course, and into our full-blown season predictions, Big Ten West predictions, potentially some like breakout players types of conversations, and a lot more. So there's a lot coming down the barrel here heading into these few weeks before the Minnesota
things you can't
game.
Even imagine.
And it's gonna be crazy. So I'm actually back in Nebraska here for about a month. So we'll be right back at it again in similar time zones finally again, coming out with content, and be on the lookout for a potential rebrand coming here on the channel as well. So this is something that we've been wanting to do for a long time, and we're finally getting the ball rolling on this. So be on the lookout for that. Don't be too surprised when something may happen over the next few weeks. And we'll talk more about that in the future as well. So thanks for watching. Drop your comments down below. We want to hear your hottest takes and your thoughts on Matt Rhule and his expectations going into the season, where you're at with that.
Tell Josh why he's wrong and we're winning every single game this season.
Amen. And where you're at with everything else in Nebraska. So we appreciate you guys for tuning in. But as always, guys, I'm Josh. That's Caleb. This has been Backseat Sports. And we will see you next time.
Go Big Red.
Go Big Red, baby.